how do we move away from accepting or managing decline and moving to stability and growth? As I go around the world, I'm reminded of how highly regarded forestry in Nova Scotia and Canada is. Since 2014, in the industry-wide, we've shed 10,000 jobs. About 2,000 of those jobs have been shed just in the last few months. This is an industry that is not averse to kind of ebbs and flows and challenges, but it always comes out the other end of them.
I'm Todd Burgess. I'm the Executive Director of Forest Nova Scotia, and you are listening to Forestry Uncut. Welcome to this week's podcast, where we'll be interviewing Derek Nighbor. He's the President and CEO of the Forest Products Association of Canada. He's held that position since 2016, and the reason he's held it for 10 years now is because he is highly respected right across the country, from British Columbia all the way through to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. He knows his subjects, he knows politics, he knows trade, he knows budgets, and he understands how the business works. I am truly excited about what you are going to hear from today's podcast. Everyone welcome Derek Nighbor. So welcome, dear listeners, to our next podcast. And our guest today is Derek Nighbor from the Forest Products Association of Canada. Welcome, Derek.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
But before we get started, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of an update about who you are and how you came to be the President, CEO of FPAC.
Yeah, so I've been leading Forest Products Association of Canada, otherwise known as FPAC, now for almost 10 years, based in Ottawa. My career took a funny path. I kind of worked in politics for a bit after doing a couple of years in banking. And then I got into the industry association world. I worked at the Retail Council of Canada, representing retailer interests for about 4 years. And then I was recruited out of there to go and run the consumer packaged goods to be the number 2 at the consumer packaged goods organization, then called Food and Consumer Products of Canada. So that's like Procter and Gamble and Heinz and Kraft, and basically 80% of what you'd see on the shelves at Sobeys, so working for those manufacturers. And then I moved over to forestry. And it was an interesting move because, of course, our business does a lot of work in packaging with those packaging manufacturers and with the retailers. But my roots are in Pembroke, Ontario, in the Ottawa Valley. And both my grandpa and my dad were unionized pulp and paper workers in Pembroke. And that's where my brother and I worked in the summers to help pay for school. So it's a sector it's not only my day job, but it's pretty near and dear to my heart, being from the Ottawa Valley.
Okay, so there is a connection there. Has it gotten more challenging since in these 10 years?
Yeah, it's different, right? Like the Trump dynamic now is something like we've never seen before. This is an industry that is not averse to kind of ebbs and flows and challenges, but it always comes out the other end of them. We may look a little bit different, but we always come out the other end. I would say what's different now is in a bad way, just this existential threat that the Trump presidency and the U.S. trade policy, and even beyond the U.S., just where we are at in the world now in terms of geopolitical and protectionism and all of those trends. But also the opportunity, I think, is finally we have a government in Ottawa that my team that we work with every day that is now more focused on the economy than we've seen a federal government since the Harper government. So that presents an opportunity in the face of the challenge.
So this is something I always think about. We hear about government and politics and international trade and tariffs. Can't forestry companies in Canada just stand up and say, okay, we're going to do this? Why do we need so much government intervention and involvement in business?
Yeah,
it's a basic question that maybe some of our listeners may not quite understand.
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think number one, and it's a little bit, the private land dynamic in Nova Scotia is quite different from many other parts of the country that I work in, because if you look at Canada's forests as a whole, more than 90% of commercial forestry in Canada is happening on public land. That's land under the purview of provincial governments. Indigenous community engagement, local community engagement is so critical there. So there's this element, I would say broadly, that it's about the people's trees. as you think about forest policy in Canada. But I also think, listen, we pay a lot of taxes in this country. There's a lot of government involvement in trying to sustain and grow the economy. Government has a big role to play when it comes to trade. We're a highly regulated sector. I think federally migratory birds, navigable water, species at risk.
Okay.
Government is very present in our lives, as you know, Todd.
So now we're working together, but we've got all these challenges. Maybe we could start, Derek, with, could you give me maybe the top to 3 to 5 challenges that you see nationally, and maybe even if some of them are provincially, and say some of the top 3 to 5 opportunities that we might have in the sector?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest challenge is this trade issue we find ourselves in with the United States. And I would also say it's not just U.S. and Canada. I'm seeing what the U.S.-China relationship and that tension is doing to pulp markets, which is having a significant impact on our pulp manufacturers in Canada because of that instability and the uncertainty. You know, if people are going to make investments in businesses, they want certainty. And this is where the global dynamics as current are really, really challenging. So, you know, we have the issue with Trump on tariffs and on softwood lumber duties and on broader trade uncertainty and what is he going to do next. And you know, if we do get a new CUSMA deal signed, is it going to be worth the paper it's printed on in terms of the ability to commit? So I think that uncertainty is a real challenge. It just brings out so much uncertainty and chaos for business, and that's not good for investment or jobs. So, like, I think that's the clear winner right now of the biggest challenge. If we look at federal, provincial, and I think this is, I see less of an issue in Nova Scotia, but it is still an issue. This issue where, especially on Crown land, where you have, you know, you might have a federal truck and a provincial truck at the same culvert asking for different things. Or the federal government and the provincial government is at a pulp mill asking for carbon or water data to be reported in different ways. I think we've long looked at the federation that is Canada and some of that relative peaceful dysfunction, if you will, as being just part of being Canadian. But when you look at the strain on our economy right now, the need for Canada to reassert itself and control what we can control, that duplication, that overlap's no longer acceptable.
Okay, so you do see a lot of overlap then between the federal government regulations and provincial regulations.
Yeah, a lot, especially at the mills in terms of, you know, you think of air, water, carbon regulations, a lot of overlap. And as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the country, you know, writ large in terms of how much public land forestry is happening in Canada, you know, you're seeing in some provinces where, you know, companies are spending millions of dollars to get their plan approved by the provincial government, only to have the federal government come in at the 11th hour to say, hey, wait a second, there's something here we don't like.
There's something else.
Yeah. So I think I think there's an opportunity here for Premier Houston and all premiers across the country to you know, look inward to see what can we control. And I know, listening to the CFO of Freeman Lumber, who was on the podcast not too long ago, talking about, you know, how do we implement the high productive forestry stuff. Like, so how do we in Nova Scotia and across the country look at ourselves, understanding the Trump stuff, and there's all the stuff going on around us, but how can we control what we can control? How can we avoid some of these unforced errors and fix the stuff and really lean into some of the things that we can control and that are going to make our industry more stable and hopefully help it grow?
Okay, so would you see opposition from, say, environmentals and NGOs that may impact that? You know, I know when in Nova Scotia, the high production forestry, we get complaints about that from certain people, just because they feel like they're putting other values at risk. Do you see that slowing anything down there, or?
Yeah, of course, it's always a factor. There's always going to be, and I think environmental groups fill a very important role. But you know, my experience in Ottawa over the last almost 10 years has been there's two types of those groups. There's the groups who you know, might push us, you know, might want to see some change, but are prepared to come to the table and have difficult conversations and work it out and try to find a win-win outcome that's going to deliver for the environment and for the economy. Then I think in the other camp, you've got some other groups that are more in the, you know, zero-sum, wanton polarization, campaign, fundraise off it, and are not interested in any solution. So I think we need to look at these groups in two different ways. And it's those groups that are more, I would say, more productive and more wanting to be at the table to work on mutual solutions that are the ones that we spend our time with. So, working with those groups is important, but some groups have different motivations,
So
which can affect the discussion.
do you spend much time with those groups? Are they in the top five, sort of that concern?
Yeah, it's an ongoing. I'm always careful when I talk about environmentalism because we are all environmentalists in forestry, in terms of
Okay, that is a
conservation
good point.
and
Yeah.
but at the same time, as I go around the world, I'm reminded of how highly regarded forestry in Nova Scotia and Canada is. People want to buy from Canada because they know that we have an incredible commitment to human rights here, that we have a real commitment to environmental outcomes and sustainability. That's the brand Canada that we have out there. So, we don't want to do anything that's going to take away from that. And that's why I think it's really important that anything that we do as we go through this current crisis, we continue to talk about those sustainability attributes and benefits of the work that we do and the products we make.
So you're doing some different work than Forest Nova Scotia does. There's another issue that I see, and that's markets for low-grade wood right across the country. I've heard about, I don't think there's a province that doesn't have a problem with markets for low-grade wood. It's something we hear about lots in Nova Scotia, especially the closure of Northern Pulp.
Yeah, it's a big issue. And the low-grade wood issue is not just an economic and a business issue, but it's also a fire issue. Because what we're seeing in some parts, and I'll use the province of Ontario as an example, where we used to have 20-ish pulp mills in Ontario, pulp and paper mills. We now have 3. So with recent closures in the last couple of years, we're now seeing a lot of sawmillers in Ontario, not too dissimilar from what Nova Scotia's experienced in terms of where do I sell my chips? Where do I sell my residuals? How do I build new markets? So there's an economic and a business challenge there, which we can talk a bit about in terms of some of the solutions. But there's also a fire risk problem there. Because if we take boots off the ground in forest management, our forests, what drought conditions look like in Nova Scotia. We've seen it here the last couple of years. We saw the brutal fires in 2023. We saw the devastation after Fiona in 2022, and what that wood on the ground means to fire risk. So low grade wood, yes, it's a big problem. There are parts of British Columbia, I would say, where the fiber basket is much tighter. BC has been on the leading edge in the worst of ways in terms of what fire impacts can do to the fiber basket. So there are parts of British Columbia where I would say it's more difficult to get fiber. But the story in most parts of the country, including Nova Scotia, is what do we do with this low grade wood? How do we find markets for it? And how do we make sure it's not piling up?
We've covered 3 or 4 now challenges. Is there any other big challenges that you see before we move on to some of these solutions?
Well, yeah, I guess the other challenge, and maybe this will lead us into the opportunities, is the housing challenge. There's no doubt the Prime Minister has made a commitment to double housing starts. We saw the Build Canada Homes. Is it Shannon Park?
Shannon Park.
Shannon Park.
Yep, 3,600 homes.
3,600 homes. That's a huge opportunity, and I'm not just looking at this selfishly from a forest sector perspective, but also from a community perspective. We need more affordable homes in Nova Scotia and across Canada. So Build Canada Homes, I think the housing challenge is one that we're seized with, even as we try to attract workers to our communities. Like, where are they going to live? Can they live affordably? So that kind of community-based infrastructure, I think, is a challenge, and maybe an extension of that. And I don't want to throw a hot potato on the table here, but I'm also thinking of infrastructure issues like the current Port of Halifax issue with the Halifax grain elevator, and because we can sign all the trade agreements we want, we can do all the regulatory stuff we want, we can have all the most robust funding programs, but if we can't get our products where they need to go by the time they need to get there, what's the point?
Right. A lot of work goes into getting everything set up, and if we just don't have the way to load a ship, that's important. Okay, so those are some of the big challenges. They seem pretty consistent with some of the issues that I talk about with our board of directors and our members here in Nova Scotia. So What are some of the big solutions that you see coming from a federal perspective?
Yeah, so if we start on the trade piece, getting to some kind of normalized trade arrangement with the United States is absolutely critical, and we know it can be done. We've seen the U.S. sign deals with Japan. We've seen the U.S. sign deals with the EU, with the UK, and others. So, there's a path here, and we don't want to rush to a bad deal for softwood lumber. And as we get into the CUSMA renegotiation, but we sell. I was looking at the numbers. We sell about nationwide about $30 billion worth of forest products to the United States every year. The next market after that is China, which is about $4 billion. So, people need to remember we've built integrated supply chains with our partners in the United States for decades and decades. We've got shared, rail and trucking routes and longtime customers. And so it's not just easy to pivot away from that because as one of the things we're hearing out of Ottawa, of course, is, well, to deal with the U.S. piece, we're going to launch a housing agenda. We're going to diversify markets. We're going to try to innovate and build new products. And all that is great. And all that are things we need to lean in on. But all of that stuff together is not going to offset the $8 billion a year of softwood lumber that Canada sells to the United States. So in terms of priorities and opportunities, hopefully we can find a path here with the United States to through softwood lumber, through the CUSMA arrangement, to bring some more predictability and sensibility and sanity to this relationship so that people can start investing again.
Okay. So do you find yourself or do you find FPAC staff members actually down in the United States talking with governors and politicians in the States? Or do you just deal with our federal MPs and hope they talk about forestry the right way?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a fine line here because I think one agreement we have with the federal government is we can't have multiple people out there saying different things and confusing the negotiation. We will not be playing a role in the actual negotiation or what we need to do, but we will be advising as we have been and will continue providing input to the federal government. It's important the federal government continues to lead those conversations so we can speak with one voice. So it's one of those things where we're not going to negotiate publicly, and we're not going to create chaos by having a bunch of different people out there telling Americans different things. So all of that advocacy with our ambassador in the United States, Kristen Hillman, with Minister Dominic LeBlanc from New Brunswick, who's the lead politician on the Canada-U.S. file, we're working really through Team Canada to advance those conversations. And where we can be helpful, we will have those conversations, and we have been.
See, I think that's a lesson that many of our listeners might like to hear. In Nova Scotia, we have many forestry groups, maybe not as many as some Scandinavian countries, but we have a lot of people talking to different politicians about what they think should be done in forestry here in Nova Scotia. And I think we are trying to, just keep them a little bit closer to have one voice or fewer voices actually talking to our politicians so we can have a unified solution moving forward.
Well, I think about our relationship in that regard between FPAC and Forest Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have your own organization to run, and you have your ideas and what you need to do. But you and I talk all the time,
Right.
and if you're going to come to Ottawa and we'll compare notes, you and I are going together tomorrow for a meeting with a Liberal MP in the South Shore. So yeah, I think that collaboration and I've been fortunate to have really good people across the country to work with who are willing to work that way. So I think the more we can be speaking with one voice, and I also find too, we've been on a lot of things we're trying to get done. We have a greater chance of success if we're working with Unifor and steel workers, if we're working with our mayors and councillors, if we're working with our local chambers of commerce, if we're working with our Indigenous partners and community leaders. So I think that collaboration and forestry is very much about community, right? Like you see that, in terms of the connection to the downtowns, the connection to local mayors and councils. So I think that's really, really important, whether it's at the provincial level or the national level, that those who are trying to kind of get the same thing done, you don't have to browbeat anybody, but you sure as heck should be having conversations and working to align where it makes sense.
We saw that this year in our forest fires. We had 8,900 hectares down in West Dalhousie forest fire. Now, compared to the rest of Canada, that is peanuts. That is a very small fire. But in Nova Scotia, that was big. and we had to, I don't remember how many homes were evacuated, but hundreds. Lots of people were evacuated, and the community came together. You talk to anyone that was worked on that fire, it was firefighters and counselors and neighbors. We all came together to actually put the fire out and support each other. So it's very much let's talk to each other for sure.
Well, and hopefully, Todd, we can do that before the next fires happen too,
Yeah.
because I think one of the things that we're seeing not only in Nova Scotia, but especially across the Boreal, where which is a natural fire disturbance, where the fires are coming through every 80 to 100 years at a minimum. How do you mitigate those risks? It was fine hundreds of years ago, maybe there were, but now we have major infrastructure. We have a lot of people living in these communities. How do we map where the risks are? How do we ensure that municipalities are supported, fire smarting your community and doing fire breaks around your community? That's not cheap, especially when you need to fix the hockey arena or the sewers need to be invested in. So I think there's also an opportunity here in the face of the fire challenge with the federal government to better support municipalities in Nova Scotia and the Nova Scotia government to help mitigate more proactively mitigate fire risks across the province and across the country.
In fact, I almost feel it should be more natural to want to manage your forest better. Just it has so many benefits to actively manage your forests around your communities. But for some reason, putting in a district heating system, why do we have to pound so hard to convince people that that's the right thing to do? I don't know.
Well, sadly, the learning, I think of communities like Grand Prairie, Alberta. I think of the communities around Jasper. I think of communities in and around Banff right now that are saying, my gosh, we could be next. I think, unfortunately, for some of these communities, it's taken the tragedy and the devastation of the recent fire years to get them thinking about, oh my gosh, we need to maybe think about this a little bit differently, and maybe calling this a protected area or turning that into a park. You're not going to it's not putting a glass dome over these things. And don't get me wrong, conservation and set-asides, all that is really, really important. But the lens through which we should be looking is more the fire lens. And right now, I'm not aware of any province that proactively is treating fire as a value as it considers forest management plans. We've had so let me give you an example of a kind of one of those federal provincial challenges. So in the last couple of years, we've had a couple of caribou population problems, mainly in Quebec and in Alberta, whereby the provincial government, through community consultation, makes a decision on what a plan's going to look like. That's approved, third-party certification in place. Federal government comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, we don't like where the caribou numbers are. We are going to potentially intervene and stop you from managing those forests. And in both of those areas, this is where a shift is starting to happen. In both of those cases now, we have been able to work with fire scientists and our foresters and ecologists on the ground to say, listen, if we don't manage here, it's going to burn. And it's not something that I think has been as top of mind, but we're starting to see the shift. But I really think over time the shift needs to be anchored in policy more actively. And it's a bit of a gap right now. And I don't know how many more fire seasons we need to go through before we start taking this stuff more seriously. And part of that is more money to support provinces and municipalities in terms of doing those proactive fire breaks and more thinning.
The carbon that's being released into the atmosphere from some of these massive fires is just astronomical.
Biggest carbon source in the country is fire.
Maybe the federal budget. Do you see some solutions in there that can help forestry across the country, businesses? What are some of the big highlights out of that?
Yeah, two of the things I just taught, the investment tax credit for biomass, which was in the budget, I think is a huge opportunity. The housing piece we talked about, the commitment to build, double home building in Canada and address the 6 million unit gap or whatnot that it is right now.
Just quick
Yeah.
interruption there. How much timber will that use? Like we send $8 billion to the U.S. Would that be one?
If that. I think the opportunity, but listen, anything incremental is good, right? But I guess my point in talking to government is don't think it's a magic bullet. Don't think you've solved our U.S. problem by doing a domestic home building problem, but by a program. But we're going to work with you. We're going to work with you to make that happen. I think the real opportunity beyond housing is, government procurement. Premier Houston's talked about that here in Nova Scotia. How can we get more Nova Scotia wood into infrastructure projects? I'm thinking federally about, you want to talk about home building opportunities? What about military housing? We have so much money going into defense. How can we do and support the military housing agenda on bases across the country? I'm also thinking about, the growing prefab modular mass timber ecosystem that's growing. It's still fairly small. It's like single digits here in terms of how many of our homes are built in a factory. You go to Sweden, it's like 85%. It's mind blowing. But as we scale that up, how can we support some of our mills and maybe do some retooling to help them kind of feed the secondary manufacturers who are going to be hopefully building more homes and factories? So again, another big opportunity, I would say, in the face of that challenge on the housing piece.
So there are these investment tax credit. Are there other things in the budget that?
Yeah, the other, I think the most tangible benefits for Nova Scotians were the investment tax credits for biomass, given the district heating opportunity and the pilots that we've seen across the province already. I would say the housing agenda piece, we talked a bit about Shannon Park, but those commitments on housing are absolutely critical. We saw significant investments in worker training supports for reskilling and upskilling workers. I think that's going to be absolutely critical. And then there were also commitments to support tariff exposed industries. So there's a package of over $1 billion specific to the lumber industry, but then there's a broader $10 billion fund for broader sectors affected by tariff or rising tariff impacts. So I think from a Nova Scotia forest sector perspective, I think if you're a business that's struggling because of tariffs, you should be talking to the federal government about what's possible. If you have workers who might be displaced temporarily or longer, there are federal supports in place to protect those workers and their families. Our goal, of course, is we want to keep as many people connected to Woodlands operations and the mills as possible. But if something happens, we need to make sure that those worker and family supports roll out very, very quickly. The other thing I would say is any innovation programs. There's a lot of focus right now on if you are looking at innovating into a new product or to get into a new market that's away from the United States, that's going to compete with an American business. That's a huge opportunity. I talked a little bit about how do we better connect the primary manufacturing sector and our sawmills to the prefab modular mass timber sector. Because if I've heard any complaints over the years, you'll hear folks in prefab and modular kind of say, I'm not getting what I need from the primary sawmills. I'm not getting and then the primary sawmills will say, well, their business is not big enough for me to kind of change how I work, because why would I sell 5 sticks over here when I can sell 50 over there? But these groups are coming together more to talk about what's possible, and it won't work for every sawmill. But there may be some hubs or some regions in Nova Scotia or in the country where we can better connect a couple of those businesses through some retooling or some innovation supports at the mills.
So there was one thing I read in the budget about capital depreciation.
Yes, yeah,
accelerated capital depreciation. Is that?
That's another lever. That's another financial opportunity for business as well. That's something I know we in the Canadian Chamber of Commerce have been asking for, and we're asking for.
Well, that's good, because in my head that seemed way bigger. Or is it not that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the business, but like every little bit helps right now, and that is an important measure to bring some financial stability and support to businesses. So I think I get asked often, or I have been asked often in recent weeks by the media, well, do you like the budget or you not like the budget? And I said, well, listen, we see ourselves in this budget in a lot of places, and that's good news. But again, the devil is going to be in the details in terms of how some of these programs roll out. But what I will say is, since we've had Prime Minister Carney in Ottawa, and we're not a partisan organization, and but the tone has changed.
Okay, that's good to know.
The tone has totally changed than it did under Prime Minister Trudeau, and we can debate, the reasons for that. There's no doubt the Trump presidency has changed the world in terms of how countries. It's changed trade. But there is more of an openness now to getting serious about how do we grow the economy, how do we protect jobs, how do we build new markets, how do we make new products, how can government help, how can government get out of the way. These are conversations we haven't been having for years with our federal government. So again, I will judge them on the full book of work. Maybe I'll come back in 5 or 10 years and we can do the assessment. But I think the early signals, there's a lot of early signals here that show a willingness to work with the sector, and to as I said, hopefully get us stable and move away from this accepting decline mindset to demanding that this sector grow and hire more people.
So outside of the budget, do you see other opportunities coming to forestry, maybe around the world?
And listen, if we can sell another $500 million anywhere, that's a good thing, right? So I know the BC and Alberta forest ministers are over in Japan and Korea this week with a number of industry folks to chat. I know folks from Nova Scotia have been over to Scandinavia to talk about business opportunities and partnerships there and learning a bit from them as well. But we see opportunities in India. We see opportunities to do more in Japan, South Korea, throughout Southeast Asia. I'm even hearing on the pulp side opportunity in the Middle East. So what's key here is these overarching trade agreements with international governments that the federal government would lead. We also need to ensure that our infrastructure, our port infrastructure especially, is able to deliver on the promise. But again, there's no overnight pivot to find $8 billion in sales somewhere around the world. But the conversations we're having, Todd, like I wish we were having these conversations with government 5-10 years ago. We're now having conversations saying, okay, where else are the Americans selling to, where maybe those people don't want to do business with the Americans anymore?
Yeah.
How can we do something in the Caribbean and in Mexico, which tend to be markets that are supplied by American wood? So those are things we're looking at now. There's already talk at some point Gaza is going to get rebuilt. At some point, the Ukraine is going to be rebuilt. That's likely going to come from European fiber. So where are the Europeans now? And when they vacate, where can we backfill? So I think the export diversification agenda, it's a slow burn, but there's a lot of opportunity for us for the long term there, and we are starting to work on that yesterday.
Okay, so AFPAC spends a bunch of time doing that?
Yeah, we've got some
Okay.
great partners that, Canada Wood Group does a lot of work. Each province has its own kind of export development folks. We do a lot of work with there's something called the Trade Commissioners Network. Canada has all of these trade commissioners who are trying to do business matchmaking around the world. That's all under Global Affairs Canada. So yeah, we're a conduit for the industry and trying to find those opportunities and build those bridges.
Well, I'm glad you actually said that, because there are a number of our listeners that have no idea that any of these things go on. They just see the pulp mill closed. I can't sell my wood anymore. What's going on? You guys aren't doing anything. So I think it's important that we have this conversation so that there's a realization. There's a lot of people doing a lot of things. It's just,
Yeah.
it would be nice if we had this all done 5 years ago.
Yeah, and you got a great port here, right? Like that's the other thing too. That's the opportunity. One of the great things in Nova Scotia, there's a port here, right? So how can we leverage that? How do we protect capacity in that port so that as we think about doing these trade deals going forward, that port's going to be there for us?
How does the softwood lumber agreement with the rest of the country, does that get in your way at all with our Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland's exclusion from it?
Not really, because I think the operating premise and it's no secret what the private land forestry or the woodlot private woodlot owners and their presence and how significant it is in Nova Scotia compared to other parts of the country. So no, I think it's, we can still be on Team Canada, and some people are in a little bit of a different place on this. I think, the one, when George from Freeman Lumber was on a couple of weeks ago, it was really interesting to hear from his perspective. One of the things that, if I might have interjected if I was on that podcast was talking about the term subsidy. And that word gets thrown out a lot, and I will defend, and international courts have defended Canada in this regard, that we, even where we're doing, harvesting on Crown land and selling it, those are not subsidies. We've won every court case in that regard. So I don't like conceding the subsidy or throwing the subsidy word out there,
Right.
because I will say that the U.S. private land, U.S. softwood lumber coalition interests are really marketed through creative writing and sensationalism and trying to drive up value for U.S. landowners. That's the modus operandi there.
Okay.
And we have seen provincial governments look at making shifts to stumpage and whatnot to accommodate the Americans. It's never been good enough. They will call everything a subsidy. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to government funding programs, every company needs to look at opportunity and risk. And for some, there might be trade risk there that would have them not want to tap into it. And I know that's a real concern for some in Nova Scotia, and I think that's very legitimate. But I also know that there are interests in the U.S. that would call everything a subsidy. And at some point here, we need to decide how are we going to stabilize and grow our sector in Canada. But like I said, I'll leave it up to the business interests to make those final decisions on what works for their businesses. But I'm very, very sensitive to the use of the term subsidy, because I think it gets kind of broadly thrown around.
So at the 45% tariffs that some of these companies are paying across the country, how often do they get those back when we win a court case?
Yeah, so the last, and I don't know what's going to happen now. The last lumber agreement, about 80% of those funds came back.
Okay.
So listen, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. All I know, at 45%, it's very, very tough to sell across the border. I was looking at the volumes across the country in October. Of comparing October of this year to last year, and shipments to the U.S. are down 25% since. And don't forget, it's not just about the tariff duty combo. We're also dealing with a U.S. economy that's not doing that great. We're dealing with a very soft economy where housing starts don't look like they're going to pick up. I think the last analyst report I read was saying probably later 2027 to 2030 is the expected hope for things to really start to turn around there. So we'll see if that materializes or not. But we're also dealing with the U.S., so it's a bit of a double whammy. You've got a soft economy and soft markets at the same time as you have these tariffs. But one thing is for sure, and that's that the Americans cannot satisfy their domestic demand. They
need imports.
They need imports. I think, so I was looking at the numbers from 2017. At 2017, the Americans satisfied about 69% of their domestic demand. Last year, it was 70%. So so pretty flat in that 70% range. Canada dropped from we were around 30% to 24%. So we've dropped about 6 points since 2017, and that 6% was made up by European exports to the United States. So it tells you that there's a market. American home builders they love northern wood because of the properties, and you want to frame your house with northern wood. They're now getting it, in terms of what they're not getting from Canada, they're getting from the EU. So I think that's one of the biggest, and I think we're starting to see some of those effects of the tariffs kind of trickle down, but it's taking time. But we are now seeing more groups. The American Association of Home Builders in the U.S. has long been critical of the policy to slap duties and tariffs on lumber from Canada because they need it, and they know that I think the last figure was $9,000 onto the average house price because of those tariffs and duties. But there's also a retail distributors group that has come out in the last week saying, listen, this is bad for American households. This is bad for business. So, at the end of the day, I think this is going to be, the shift needs to come from the American side here. But the data shows that they continue to need lumber from outside of the country.
Okay. So, Derek, we do have Forest Nova Scotia's annual general meeting coming up in February. It's a big event in Nova Scotia. There's a couple of big events, but the Forest Nova Scotia AGM is one of the bigger ones. As we head into that new year, what do you foresee this coming year? What are the big developments that you may see?
Well, I'm planning to come if you'll still have me.
Yes.
Okay, great. And maybe I'll say what I hope to share with you when I come back to Halifax in February. So I hope that we have some kind of a deal with the United States that works for both countries. That's the first thing on my kind of Christmas list. If we like, I really hope for the people in our communities who depend on this sector that we get to some common sense here with the United States.
Do you think we can get there by February?
I hope so. I really hope
Okay.
so. I really do. I really do. We can't rush to a bad deal. Don't get me wrong, but we need to do our best. We've got a lot to offer. We've got so much in common between our two countries. There's so many opportunities with all the threats more globally around us. So that's my first hope is when I come back in February that we're going to see some kind of either a deal in place or we're very clearly in a much better spot on the trade front. I want to see the Build Canada Homes program having created real results. I think there's huge opportunity there, and we'll see in the next few months, hopefully, more announcements, more shovels in the ground. The third thing I would say is I'm hopeful to see some real commitment and movement by especially the federal government on regulatory reform and sensibility and one window reporting and on some of those things. So those would be my three, Canada, U.S. trade, that we're in a much better spot, that we're making some real action for the benefit of families on the housing agenda, and that we're having some kind of more sensible approach from Ottawa on how they're regulating this sector and what burdens they're putting on the people working in this sector.
Well, that's good. If you came with good news for all those three things, I think we'll be in a fine place.
Yeah, and then maybe I'll add a fourth. And so for those on the biomass side, like I would expect by February we'll have a much clearer view or line of sight to the rollout of that investment tax credit program, I really hope that's going to be as open and permissive as possible to really incentivize investment, and that's going to be good for the economy. That's going to be good for energy security, and as I said earlier, that's going to be good to find markets for that biomass so it's not piling up and creating a fire risk.
Yeah. I know we've got a number of proposals that are before the provincial government for new facilities that are planned here in Nova Scotia.
We have to keep in mind the opportunities in the face of the challenges here. And I think this industry has proven to be very resilient. Like, I remember coming to Halifax right after the Northern Pulp closure was announced. That was the most challenging speech I've given on stage. I'm not from here. I love Nova Scotia and I love coming here and I have a lot of friends here, but I don't live here and I'm not living every day on the ground. And I wasn't sure. I remember when I came to, I wasn't sure what the mood was. I had an idea what the mood was going to be. I'm like, what do I say to these people? How do I give these people some sense of hope and promise? And I see now, yeah, challenges remain, but we're still here. We're still here, and
They're shrinking.
we're shrinking, but that has been the story. I think we've lost since 2014, the industry wide. We've shed 10,000 jobs. About 2,000 of those jobs have been shed just in the last few months. So we've definitely seen, but one of the things I see is an opportunity to move away from accepting decline. And how do we move away from accepting or managing decline and moving to stability and growth? And I'm really hopeful through a number of these levers we talked about today, the domestic housing agenda, the procurement agenda through federal and provincial governments, leveraging the biomass opportunity for heat and electricity generation. Yeah. Bit by bit, if we can thread some of this together, improve the regulatory framework, finally get to some kind of a normalized agreement with the United States. I do think there's potential because global markets for wood are growing. And we're better to get it than from Canada. So, so I think trying to stay focused on those, I don't want to sugarcoat things. There's a lot of challenge out there, but there are some opportunities here. I know that your group and our group and our governments are committed to working on together.
Right. I for some reason, I keep defaulting to district heating systems fueled by biomass, combined heat and power plants to heat towns. Right now, most of our towns in Nova Scotia are heated by furnace fuel or electric heat pumps or electric baseboard heaters. And we import all of that. And it seems frustrating to me when these communities are surrounded by forests that we could fuel these heat and take the pressure off the electricity grid.
Yeah, and these become opportunities as well in that procurement agenda because I know governments are often thinking about building, with wood, but what else, how can we leverage the biomass piece and the heating piece as part of that conversation in the procurement play as well? I was in Thunder Bay a while ago. Confederation College in Thunder Bay, Ontario is heated by biomass. There is an opportunity. There is an opportunity, especially with new structures, new hospitals, new schools, those kinds of things. I think those are areas where I hope the procurement agenda considers the district heating or the biomass opportunity at the front end.
We need to get together. Well, I think we're doing a fine job of it. Your conference just held in Ottawa, I find it enlightening every time I go there, just about how much effort is going into communicating with the politicians and policy and all the good speakers we have.
Yeah, well, and I appreciated you and Jill coming to that, and it was good for the soul for us too in terms of our team. It's been a tough few months. I mean, I say that understanding how much tougher that is for people on the ground who have businesses or are contractors who have so much uncertainty they're facing right now. We feel that deeply. As I said at the top, I'm the grandson and the son of unionized pulp and paper workers from the Upper Ottawa Valley. This is an industry that put food on the table. I'm not sure I would have gone to school if not for that job my dad had as a machine operator at the plant. So I get it. I get the importance of these jobs, and that's why the advocacy that our team does is with a lot of purpose and passion. So we'll continue to work with you and do what we can to fight for Nova Scotia forestry workers and forestry workers across the country.
Very good. Thanks, Derek.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you're listening to the podcast, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. We would love for you to subscribe, like, and share it with people that maybe you know or other people in the sector. If you want to learn more about Forest Nova Scotia, the organization that I work for, you can go to forestns.ca. That's our website. You can click on there, listen to our podcast, and find out more information about forestry and the forest sector in Nova Scotia.